Hello, I'm Richard Hall and this is Impact Exchange. Today on Impact Exchange, I'm joined by Professor Simon Wilkie, Dean of the Monash Business School. G'day Simon, nice to have you on Impact Exchange.
Hi Richard, great to be here.
Now, 35 years in the United States of America, a very successful career, Simon. Started out your doctoral studies there and then went on to work at Caltech, senior appointments to the Federal Communications Commission, then at University of Southern California, and most recently as Chief Economic Policy Strategist at Microsoft Corporation. So quite a wild ride in the US, but after 35 years, you're back in Australia. What brought you back to Australia?
Well, frankly, as you mentioned, I'd had vast success in the United States, both in government, academia, and finally industry. But looking around, I realized I hadn't done anything in Australia. I'd left Australia at an early age. So at one level, wanted to give something back. And in particular, this opportunity at Monash came along, which is just a fantastic opportunity. So frankly, I leapt at it.
Great.
It was just the right point in time.
What about the changes that you would have noticed in that period of time? I mean, you left in the 80s, and that was a time of considerable change in the Australian policy landscape and Australian culture, I guess, as well, in hindsight. What have you noticed, and what's different now about Australia?
So it's a dramatically different country. Obviously, Australia's gone through this transformation in terms of markets being opened up, in terms of deregulation. Right. It was a very staid, button-down country when I left, economically very conservative. Obviously now it's much more diverse, so culturally much more interesting. It's also, frankly, much wealthier than the country that I left. So I think Australia's a bigger player on the world stage. Mm-hmm. It's a more interesting place to be, and much more dynamic than it used to be.
And in terms of, I guess, the international stage, we think about Australia as having a relatively large financial services sector, for example, but also being very resource dependent traditionally. So how's Australia seen in those kind of policy terms now, other than, I suppose, enjoying unprecedented period of economic growth and no recession? But, how's it seen in policy terms, do you think?
So there was an interesting piece in The Economist magazine about 6 months ago about how Australia could be a lesson to other countries. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the issues that are tearing other countries apart, they're not as prevalent in Australia. So, for example, we've had a record-breaking period of going without a recession. So at one level, we must be doing something right policy-wise. In addition, we've had record amounts in immigration that haven't seemed to have caused the same degree of social disintegration that we had in other countries. Yeah. And we've had a record increase in the level of the standard of living without the same degree of massive increases in inequality that we've seen in other countries.
Right.
So if you look at it overall, and this is borne out by much economic analysis, yep. We're in a sweet spot. We've had a better run, so we must be doing things righter than other countries.
I mean, more generally, I guess we could say, surely we're living in challenging times in policy because of the nature of contemporary change. The Chinese say we live in interesting times, the phrase digital disruption. We've known for some time that it's estimated 40% of Australian jobs are in danger of automation. Gartner comes out and says 65% of knowledge workers are likely to have their jobs fundamentally restructured and recast by digital. Whole sectors are being disrupted and challenged by new disruptors and challenges. So where are we at in terms of what some people are calling a revolution here?
So I was on the front lines of this when I was at Microsoft.
Sure.
And it changed the way I'm thinking as an economist. This really is an industrial revolution. This is the fourth industrial revolution. That's a term that's thrown around a bit. Industry 4.0.
Yep.
But the question is, what is it and why now? So let me unpack it a little bit.
Sure.
So this is all about what I like to call ubiquitous ambient intelligence. It's not about data per se, it's about intelligent systems replacing, as you mentioned, white-collar jobs, traditional areas of human expertise. And it's driven by a couple of things. First of all, 54 billion sensors
Wow.
are going to be put in place by 2020. And we're almost at 2020, generating vast amounts of data. So we have massive amounts of data being generated. So what? You can't do anything with the data if it just sits there. We've had the communications revolution, which allows that data to be backhauled cheaply and inexpensively. The third part of the puzzle is we've had the rise of cloud computing. Cloud computing allows massive amounts of computation to be done at much lower prices than before. And second of all, it's much more elastic. It can be done on demand. You don't have to invest in a giant physical infrastructure and keep that hanging around for the one time of the year when it's used. The final bit of the puzzle, of course, is the advances in AI and machine learning, which have been really dramatic over the last few years. So you put all those together and boom, you have the ability to transform businesses, you have the ability to transform markets, you have the rise of, the most obvious example of course is Uber, which is an app which matches buyers and sellers. It creates a market and replaces existing institutions. This is accelerating.
Sure.
What we're seeing, as you mentioned, this is actually moving up, if you will, the job food chain.
Okay.
And so it's disrupting industries, it's disrupting employment, but more importantly, it's changing the form and function of organizations.
Okay, so ubiquitous ambient intelligence, Simon. What exactly do you mean by that?
Let me give you an example. So we worked on developing a melanoma detection app. Anybody with a phone with a camera can take a picture. It gets sent back to the cloud, analyzed. AI can tell with 97% accuracy whether or not that's a melanoma. To put that in perspective, the best Beverly Hills skin surgeon is about 95% accurate.
Wow.
Your GP is about 70% accurate. So what we've done is democratize this intelligence that was a very specialized, expensive skill, and taken it and made it so that you don't have to think about it. It's just on your phone. It's therefore it's ambient. And we were able to deploy this in the bush in Africa. So it's ubiquitous. So what was previously a highly localized, specialized skill becomes something that becomes worldwide, easily available. You don't have to think about it, and we've democratized the intelligence.
And obviously made access to that kind of very important service much more affordable.
That's exactly what's happening. We were also doing this with medical clinics in Botswana, just providing the intelligence of the University of Pennsylvania's medical school to clinics in the bush.
And do you think, I mean, obviously the application's there, but if I think about an urbanised Australian environment, do you see those kind of applications as well as being a net benefit for us here? I mean, other than having to go to the dermatologist?
Yes, so the net benefit of all of this, of course, is huge. As what was previously, if you will, only available to the 1%
Yep.
becomes democratized.
Yep.
The social
Yep.
value is huge.
Well, I want to go back, if I can, though, what's it doing to jobs, and I guess the way we're working, because there seems to be mixed signals here about how jobs are already changing. I mean, in some senses, we can see that the automatable parts of even professional roles are being automated, and there's job losses there. I mean, if we look at areas like law and finance, for example, I mean, I don't know if you've had examples that you've seen. Perhaps indeed in Microsoft there are examples where you've seen job change because of this. So that's really quite threatening for many professionals. Is that right?
That's correct, in the short term.
Okay.
So firsthand I've seen this happen. We at Microsoft used AI to replace traditional finance and legal jobs,
Wow.
in particular combining natural language processing with other predictive techniques. We were able to dramatically improve the financial forecasting of
Right.
Microsoft. So
Right.
the financial forecasts are now generated by algorithms rather than the traditional ground up work done by people in the finance department. what's interesting about this is, of course, it's not just replacing the quarterly finance report, but it's nowcasting. We can continuously get the forecast as new data comes in. So this this is quite revolutionary. Jobs are being destroyed, but new jobs are being created. Similarly, we've seen we were involved in similar transformations in the way contracts are written and reviewed. Again, this isn't replacing manual jobs, this is replacing fairly high-skilled jobs. So there is that transition that's going on. On the other hand, new jobs are being created. What we're seeing at the moment, when you look at the data, is this split. Lots of the new jobs that are being created are, if you will, more low-value service jobs.
Yeah, right.
But also we're seeing the creation of the more higher paid, higher skilled jobs. And those jobs are the ones, not just people who write code, but they're ones that economists would call complements to the new technology.
Okay.
So the people with the complementary skill sets, their future is very bright.
Okay.
And so, for example, what's a complement to AI?
Right.
It's EI, so emotional intelligence. What we're seeing paradoxically is that the soft skills that are often overlooked, in particular around educational institutions, are going to be more valuable, not less valuable.
Okay, so the future's maybe not just going to belong to the data scientists. In fact, there might be some pockets there where actually, I don't know, data science or data workers or, might be caught up in automatable parts of their job. But actually there's going to be a greater role, would you say, or a continuing role for that human element around the emotional side of things?
I think it's a greater role. It's going to be much more, a much bigger part of the economy, and it's going to be much more personally rewarding, I think, as people go away from more rote mechanical tasks, even if they're mechanical brain tasks rather than physical tasks, to stuff where they get to express themselves as a human.
Okay.
I think what we're seeing is we're going to see importance put on that human connection. We're going to see importance put on creativity, and we're going to see an increasingly move into positions where people find perhaps more fulfillment, it's more self-expression in their job.
So better quality of work, a better quality of a work experience there, a richer, more rewarding experience of work for those perhaps who are lucky enough to have those jobs. But aren't we, though, Simon, at the same time going to continue to see an increasing inequality and bifurcation between those high-quality, enriched jobs through technology and AI, and the continuation of the low-end service jobs that we do still see increasing, I think, in contemporary political economy?
So we are seeing that dramatically in the data today.
Right.
Personally, I'm optimistic that this is the transition period that we're going through. When you look at, say, the second industrial revolution, which had a similar impact to this one, we saw exactly this transition, right? So we saw, after the first industrial revolution, mechanical skills being replaced with machine power. We saw the period of de-skilling of jobs being destroyed. But then at the start of the 20th century, we saw new jobs being created with new skills.
Right.
And frankly, we saw a new social contract. So to give you the most glaring example, it used to be considered okay to have kids work in factories, right? Childhood labor was just part of life.
Sure.
Then as a society, we decided, let's take that part of the population out of the labor force and do something else. We decided education was a good thing.
Yeah.
And so we had mandatory schooling, we had free schooling.
Right.
This is a revolutionary new social contract. So what I think, looking forward, is we're going to see changing roles, we're going to see a new social contract emerge.
Okay.
Again, we're in the education business. I think education's going to be a large part of it as we move to viewing education as being a lifelong journey rather than something you do for the first X years of your life.
Right.
So I think ultimately what we will see is the same thing that we saw last time around, which is the long period of sustained economic growth, of deepening of the wealth distribution and the dramatic decrease in inequality that we saw between, say, 1900 and 1980.
Okay, optimistic scenario. I've got to ask you though about this, about the responsibility for managing this sort of transition. Okay, so who's responsible? To what extent do corporations and organisations need to be thinking about how we're going to deal with this adjustment process, whereby you talk about a new social contract? How are we going to help reskill and re-equip workers who are being left behind in some ways or caught out in this transitional period? And is there a role, again, for policy and the state here? I think we're together on the education side of things, but are there things like a universal basic income, which is sometimes discussed, that could have a role here? Have you got views about that, Simon?
So, yes, I think this is going to, it's a social transition. It's difficult. So we need actually every party to come to the table. So I agree it has to involve government. I agree it has to involve corporations, and in particular corporate leadership.
Okay.
Really has to be addressing this head on. I think some companies are. I think other companies are running away from it. I think some countries are running away from it and not having a serious discussion. And I think we, the leading educational institutions, have a major role to play in shaping and forming the dialogue. So all of the constituent stakeholders, I think, have an important role. And though I am a fan of universal basic income, I don't believe, like some of my Silicon Valley friends, that that's a panacea.
Okay.
And you shouldn't trust me because I'm an economist. But I think beyond just the level of income, there's questions around identity, self-worth, digital inclusion. These are bigger things that just universal basic income won't solve. These are bigger social interests where it shouldn't just be you and me discussing this, right? We need a full social engagement.
Okay, so let's talk about the fourth industrial revolution and implications for universities and business schools in particular, and something which has got to be very much on your agenda, Simon, is what does it mean for us in a business school? What's this future mean in terms of the kind of programs we've got to be doing, the kind of research perhaps we've got to be undertaking, and certainly the kind of skills that we're trying to develop in our students?
So I think we have a challenge. We need to refresh our curriculum. We need to refresh the delivery of our content. We need to be much more engaged with the business community than we have been traditionally. I'm not saying that we weren't engaged, but I think the nature of the engagement has to be a little bit different because it has to be more of a two-way street. That is, the economy is driving this transition. Companies have problems. We need to be learning from the company what the true nature of the problem is rather than the academic nature of the problem. So I'm convinced that we actually have tremendous value to add here, tremendous social value, because of the horsepower that we have. But we need to be engaged. We need to be asking the right questions as academics. We need to encourage the things that firms will be looking for in this transition. Agile mindsets, team building ability, entrepreneurial thinking, design thinking. We need to step up our game in those areas. We've already made some progress, I think, and we've had a couple of roundtables around issues where we've brought faculties across different groups together, and I'm blown away. Everybody's blown away when you see what we have when we put everybody together. I'm convinced we will become the thought leaders at this interdisciplinary confluence. Given the strength that we have in the disciplines, that's building that organically is what I hope to achieve.
Simon, it's an exciting vision, and let's hope that it's not only good for Monash, but that it's good for Australia.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.